The government has tools that those charities do not have: technologies, international cooperations, intel agencies, and surveillance. There's only a handful of countries on the planet that have the level of resources to deal with these issues better than the ability to respond right now.
That's why they call it Mondays
Bye bye.
with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
So there's an Ebola outbreak in Central Africa. It's been there for a while, but now it's festering. Almost a year and a half ago, Doge cut USAID funding. I wonder if there is a link between the two. Do you think there is?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, what is the link?
Actually, there's an article I'm going to refer to by a journalist named Nicholas Crain. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called "This is Why You Don't Slash Humanitarian Aid" on June 3rd, and the link is threefold. The two that I'm going to talk about are Doge cut funding and staff for USAID, and in the article he cites a USAID employee who worked in the 2014 Ebola outbreak, who talked about how they were able to catch the Ebola outbreak early and treat it and contain it because of the USAID funding then, that they had the resources and supplies and the doctors to make it happen in terms of protective equipment and all the things that you needed to make it contained, and that the absence of that now is what helped contribute to the spread of this current Ebola outbreak. Would it have succeeded entirely? Who knows? Could it help? Could it have helped mitigate the effects? Absolutely. The other issue has to do with the WHO of the United States leaving the World Health Organization, and also in removing the funding that we were providing to the WHO and the sharing of information. That led to some blind spots, right? To some gaps in our knowledge and our response that reduced the effectiveness of the response on the part of the United States to this particular crisis. So, in terms of what you're asking, did those have an effect? Absolutely. So, what science gives us is a window into more truth than less truth. It provides sunlight on the issues that surround the world. And if you fire the experts and you fire the doctors and you don't spend the money on, specifically, there's a term for it called surveillance, then you don't have as full a picture of the problem and how to respond to it effectively. So I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Outbreak or if you've ever seen the movie Contagion. They're both about the spread of disease. But the whole idea is that these people who are paid through something like USAID, they will go to the most remote locations, way out in the middle of nowhere. And they can do it because they have the resources to get there. They can buy a car, they can pay the gas, they can have the resources to go on a long journey. And through those efforts, we can figure out where these diseases are starting way before they spread in the manner that they have now. And the issue also just it comes down to things like opportunity costs. UID was paying doctors in these places to be doctors. When you remove the funding for these people to be doctors, those communities may not be able to afford to pay these doctors at the same levels or at all. And so those doctors, instead of being doctors, go and drive a cab, go and farm, become a fisherman, right? Go and do whatever makes them money because they got to feed their families, right? They got to live their lives. And so what USAID provided was an opportunity in some of these places that are stricken with war, instability, poverty, the effects of natural disasters. These are not necessarily the richest or wealthiest parts of the world, but they need the assistance. What USAID could do was provide that assistance, right? And in the grand scheme of things, it didn't cost the United States that much. Foreign aid was less than 1% of our total budget. In the grand scheme of things, it was a blip, right? If you look at the U.S. defense budget, they're asking for 1.5 trillion, and USAID was less than 100 billion. Like, it wasn't a lot of money, right? But the results, the outcomes that we were getting delivered from USAID were worth way more than that. It helped us stop the spread of pandemics, to stop the spread of Ebola. Violent hemorrhagic fever, right? Bleeding from every orifice in your body. Not good, right? No, not good at all. Dangerous, scary, fatal for a lot of people. And the way you stop that spread, the military's. I mean, one thing I remember. I don't remember where I read this exactly, but in natural disasters, the number one responders were the U.S. military. They'd show up with a hospital ship and provide doctors and medical care and all sorts of, aid. I don't know if the U.S. military is still doing that, but there was a time in our lifetimes that, in particular, the earthquake. Do you remember that big earthquake that hit Indonesia
And the subsequent tsunami?
and the tsunami that killed hundreds of thousands of people all around the world? One of the big responders to that particular disaster was the United States military. They showed up with the hospital ships and help, right? With planes and troops and just assistance. When you cut things like USAID and you change your priorities in terms of just general humanitarian assistance around the world, things that could have been like essentially bad things become worse, right? Is the way to think of it. That yes, bad things happen, right? Because bad things happen. Natural disasters happen, diseases happen, outbreaks happen, but our response to it fits into a variety of categories. There's the no response category. That's a bad idea, right? Because that means bad things can become catastrophic. There's the limited response category. So what happened in that, do you remember that earthquake where the U.S. only sent 2 people and they sent them a few days after the fact? It's after Doge stopped all funding the USAID and fired all the experts on earthquakes and stuff, where the U.S. response was pitiful compared to the other countries that showed up. So China showed up, Russia showed up, a bunch of countries showed up to help, and the United States sent 2 people days after. I mean, it was just incredibly sad.
Could have been Myanmar, could have been the Philippines.
I think it was Myanmar. There was an earthquake in Myanmar, and what happened was that there was a time when the U.S. would have been first on the ground, and they would have had a significant response team, 20, 30, 40 people with knowledge of the local communities and connections that could get things moving, make the response effective at saving people, rescuing people from rubble, rebuilding. For the Trump administration, they sent 2 people, and they sent them a few days after, like the response time window, because usually for a disaster, you want to respond a window of time that has like the most effective response. Not this Trump administration. Nope, no one showed up, and that just makes the U.S. look really bad, right? It makes us look like we don't care at all about things that happen around the world, and it makes us a poor neighbor. And look, with Spider-Man with great power comes great responsibility. If the U.S. wants to play at being the world hegemon, the world's only major superpower, that isn't just destroying things. That's also building things, right? Building connections. It's a lattice of interconnected things. And if you take out the different pieces of the lattice, someone else will come in to fill those gaps. And USAID effectively served as the glue between the United States and less developed parts of the world to give us a good reputation amongst them. That if they needed help, they turned to the United States. And in that regard, we could also then help on other issues of importance to us, resource control, military issues. There's a whole list of things where what it did was created the opportunity to open the door for more dialogue, more diplomacy, more communication, more cooperation. Right now, the Trump administration has effectively shut the door, right? They've shut down almost all refugee claims, almost all asylum claims. They're trying very hard to stop illegal immigration, I understand, but they're also trying really hard to stop legal migration. And they're trying to kick people out who are permanent residents here and trying to denaturalize people who try to pursue citizenship here. This is virtually unheard of. That part hasn't happened, to my knowledge, for most of U.S. history, where people who applied to be citizens and were naturalized where the government then decided those people went through an awful lot of hoops and a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of vetting to become U.S. citizens. You know what the government needs to focus on now? Figuring out ways to remove their citizenship and kick them out. That's new. That part is very new. And I have a pretty good idea why they're doing it. It goes back to what I was saying, that they're trying to kick people off the voter rolls. And one way to do that is to come up with novel strategies to kick them out of the country.
Yeah, do you think, by the way, that also has to do with applying for visas while remaining in their own countries? Because a little bit of backstory here is that people used to be able to get visas in this country, but now the Trump administration for certain countries. And what's the overlap here?
Okay, so I'm going to piece the puzzle together for you right now. There was an article, it was either today or yesterday, that they're charging $750 the visa approval process. To get approved for a visa, generally you have to do an interview and you have to go in for the interview. And it takes sometimes months or up to a year to actually go in for the visa interview. If you pay $750 in some countries, they're expediting that process. So you move up in the ladder. So how do you make people really annoyed waiting for a visa to get into the country? You send them back to wherever they came from and make them wait a long time, right? And so what's one way to incentivize them to spend $750 and pour money into the coffers of the United States? You make them wait less time, right? But how do you create that unpleasantness in the situation and the discomfort where they're like, I really want to spend that money so I can get back to the United States where my family and my friends are, or my job or whatever. You do that. You force everybody who wants a visa or permanent residency to leave, hundreds of thousands of them, make them go back to wherever country they came from, and then you charge them money to speed up the process, right? So that, for me, is the puzzle piece. So I was like, why is this happening? That's why. They want money. And they want to figure out a way to motivate people to spend money. And you do that by making people uncomfortable. But also, it's old-fashioned racism, right? If you look at U.S. immigration policy, there's an awful lot of racism and xenophobia. If you look at the quota system of which countries have quotas for legal migration, it's wildly all over the place. Some countries have a 30-year wait period, others don't. And the quotas are just all over There was a time in this country where no Chinese were allowed to live in the country. Period. No one could apply for citizenship. They got kicked out. There was a whole thing, and then that changed. Whatever the current flavor of political resentment is in the country, and right now the Trump administration's resentment is virtually all illegal immigrants need to leave, and they're trying to make it more unpleasant and more difficult for legal migrants to stay here and to live here and to apply for citizenship here. And there's no question that there's an element of racism to it all.
So you think it's racism, and you think that it's also getting money, which seems to be a theme
So
here. So
I think it's
but
both.
another,
I think
yeah,
I think there's racism is to
but
keep certain people out, but then money is for certain people to come back in. And it's
yeah,
the ones with money, right?
because I looked at it initially, and I thought, oh, well, it's because they didn't fund USAID, and then you don't think that is it, and so you don't think it's to keep Ebola out.
No, so to keep Ebola out, what they're doing is they're quarantining people
okay,
outside of the country, and they're banning people from coming into the country from Ebola countries. That's different.
Oh, they're banning them,
They're banning them.
so they can't apply for the visas.
Can't come in.
Okay.
But no, for the Ebola, there's protests in Kenya right now because what they're doing is they're building an Ebola facility, a medical facility, the U.S., and there's protests. It's a multi-million-dollar facility, and that's where they want to send the U.S. Ebola patients and anyone the U.S. is treating. The U.S. is having a response right now to Ebola. It's just a delayed response, right? Where it served a role was in trying to help earlier, right? Like way early, you catch it as soon as you can and then deal with it then. Right now, what the U.S. is doing is playing catch up, right? That we're addressing it, but in a delayed manner. And the delay is where the issue occurs that the outbreak spreads, right? That you need to have contact tracing, you need containment. Now we're trying our very best. This reminds me an awful lot of the COVID crisis. That they fired the people who. It's a whole day. Like this is the same movie over again, right? We're seeing the same nonsense. That you fire the scientists and the experts, and then you throw your hands up in the air and like, what could we have done? That you
yeah.
could have had the doctors and the experts, the people who knew what they were doing, deal with the thing instead of like doing it way after the fact. It's so dumb. I'm sorry that
Yeah, we're pretty fed up about it.
I'm a little. Have we learned nothing? Is this really where we're at? Like, in terms of some of the moves, it's not necessarily racism. It comes down to money. So do you remember the Trump a gold card or whatever, the $5 million for.
Yeah, did they actually do that, or was that just an idea?
I think they did it, right? But it all comes down to money, right? Like the U.S. Treasury is out of money. We're heavily in debt. So what do? We create all sorts of avenues for revenue, right? Just how do you get people to spend money? You say you do this or you don't get in, or it takes you a year. And most people don't want to wait a year to get in. They want to get in, right? Like,
It's very tragic, especially since the outbreak in Democratic Republic of the Congo is reporting 606 cases and 136 deaths, and that's approximately 20% fatality rate. It'll probably be higher than that because some of those cases will in future result in deaths. So, anybody that can help with this should. So the question I would ask, is there room for either private charities or the UN or some kind of international effort to pick up where USAID left off? You don't think so?
Yeah, good.
But so the issue actually is one of resources, right? The government has tools that those charities do not have access to. In particular, certain kinds of technologies and certain kinds of international cooperation where they can utilize intel agencies and surveillance to get much more robust information than the information that private charities could have access to. And that's, I think, where the real issues arise for something like this is that there's only a handful of countries on the planet that have the level of resources that at their disposal to deal with these issues in ways that are better than the ability to respond right now. And that's, I think, where it gets really tricky is that in some cases, and I know this seems a little strange, but in some of these circumstances, the responses would actually be done by not just USAID, but it would be done by things like the military or things like various government agencies. So, the US military deploys medics with humanitarian missions around the world, Iraq, Afghanistan, around the Indo Pacific, and a variety of other places where what they do is that they send these combat medics to train in crisis zones. But part of what gets them in the door is stuff like USAID. So USAID would set up the initial infrastructure of medical facilities, trainings, places where they hire doctors, and then the military would fly people in essentially to provide medical care and services. And what makes that unique is that the military has technologies at its disposal to get people places way faster than the response otherwise might be, right? That they have state of the art aircraft. They have abilities to travel and logistics in place that can make the response time way faster than these private charities could ever hope to get because they have abilities to travel into remote terrain and other areas that frankly, like the technology and the commercial space is very limited for some of these places to get into. But you've got giant helicopters and certain types of military apparatus that 100% can go way up into the mountains. They can go into dense jungles. They have the ability to land really fast and to carry a lot of troops and equipment and everything you can need, right? But what gets them in the door, what provides that opportunity, is the interagency. Remember, it's a lattice. The interagency cooperation that because they're a military operation, to avoid the appearance of espionage or spying, they need the, I guess you could call it, not the cover, but the legitimacy of a non-military organization,
Institution.
agency of the government institution to get them in there. And so when I say that the effectiveness of the response is something that only the U.S. could do, it's because only the U.S. has the ability with its military of being in every part of the world at the same time, right? That the United States can communicate like that very fast and it can respond to crises place by place if it wanted to way faster than any other country on the planet, right? Because we have the most aircraft carriers, we have the fastest planes, we have the best planes. And so that's what I mean by our ability to respond was diminished by the cuts to USAID and the shuttering of it and the cuts to the World Health Organization. Because the WHO is through the UN, right? It's one of the programs that the UN offers. And I was reading for the medics in Haiti, where the United States does training for combat training, right? In the ghettos of Haiti and the areas riddled with gang violence, where there's a lot of fighting all the time, like stabbings and shootings. that U.S. combat medics get training to simulate wartime conditions in Haiti. The similar kind of idea can apply for things like Ebola or things like other diseases, is that you get a similar level of training for wartime spread through the military. But you need USAID or the WHO to do it. You need the UN. You need not the facade. You need the cooperation. There you go. You need the legitimacy.
You need the aegis.
Yeah, you need the mandate, right? You need to say, we're here to help as an international humanitarian mission, not a military mission. It's a humanitarian aid effort, right? That we're trying to help, not spy, not attack.
We grieve for those affected by Ebola, and hopefully our foreign policy here will come to its senses and help people out, because with great power comes great responsibility, and the United States still has great power, despite it all.
There's one thing I did want to say. It's a real tragedy that these countries aren't able to marshal the resources to manage these crises on their own, that the state of the world is such that for whatever reason, these countries don't have the economic and technological wherewithal to provide all the protective equipment they need to their staff, to hire enough doctors, to do all the stuff, right? It shouldn't be the case that the United States needs to intervene in places that have such extreme poverty, but it is the case that there are parts of the world that have such high levels of disparity that, frankly, Europe or the United States or China or Russia, countries with a lot more resources, could and should intervene. Because outbreaks don't stay, we saw this with COVID, outbreaks don't stay confined to the borders of a country. They'll expand outwards. And it's to our benefit to spend a little money now to not spend a lot more money later, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I remember when there was the Ebola crisis. Do you remember during Obama's administration when there's the issue with Ebola and a guy with Ebola came to the United States and there was an extreme quarantine measure? I think there was one in New Jersey and one in Texas where the person got essentially trapped in a bubble in New Jersey, and then in Texas they figured out where the person with Ebola was and contained them pretty much.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I don't really think we want to end up with that kind of situation again, where there's people with, again, a violent hemorrhagic fever, possibly spreading it to other people in the U.S., which is why I think that they're banning all travelers from certain countries that have.
That's right. Yeah, and with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, too, it's a particularly tragic case because the Belgians King Leopold and his ilk really did that place wrong, and when they left, it was like 150 people in the whole country. The remaining had like university degrees or something. It was a resource extraction and no integration into the community of nations.
It's also the saga of colonialism, right? That all these various powers just drew lines on the map without actually accounting for who lived there, and just said, this is a country now and this is a country now. And the end result was that you have all these various warring tribes and communities that weren't actually part of the same group, and it led to all sorts of, we see it now, all these civil wars and the fighting and the general chaos and anarchy that's been going on in certain parts of Africa for a long time. That civil war in the Congo has been 50-ish years. It's the only peacekeeping mission I know of where they have active warfare. Usually peacekeeping missions from the UN are defensive only, right? That they'll only fire if fired upon. As far as I know, I don't know if it's still ongoing, but at one point the UN peacekeeping in the Congo became an aggressive peacekeeping mission, that they had the ability to actually engage in fighting, which is unique. It's the only one that I know of in all of the peacekeeping missions that have ever been done. UN.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The dismal situation continues. Mondays with Mike.